Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. So today we are diving into a topic that is very crucial, but it is more often overlooked by all the riders. Yes, as you all might know from the thumbnail itself, it is all about motorcycle suspension. Whether you're cruising on the highways or carving through the twisties or tackling off-road trails, your bike suspension plays a key role in your ride quality and safety. So let's dive into it. Let's start with the front, folks. These are the shiny tubes that you see in front of your bike. They compress and extend to absorb shocks from the road. Inside, you'll find a combination of springs and dampening mechanism that work together to smoothen out your ride. Now, the rear shock is a bit different but serves the same purpose. It is usually a single unit mounted between the frame and the swing arm. Just like the front, folks, it uses a spring and damping systems to handle bumps and keep your ride stable. In order to understand better, let's check out the suspension itself. This is an old suspension from my NS200 and I'll be using this for demonstration purpose. You can see the several parts in the suspension, but primarily it is composed of a spring and the damper itself. Now let's understand the internal working of the damper itself. It is primarily consists of a damper rod and the piston, a check valve, and few holes that is named as a compression dampers and a rebound damper. The entire unit is filled with hydraulic oil and also oil seal to prevent the hydraulic oil leaking out of the chamber, and also dust seal to prevent any dust or debris entering into the chamber. Now this type of suspension setup is called as twin tube shock absorbers, and there is one more type is called as mono shock absorbers. So I'll be explaining that in a moment, but let's see how this thing works now. When the shock absorber is compressed, the fluid inside this chamber needs to go somewhere. So that's where the specifically designed holes called as compression dampers come into picture. Hydraulic fluid starts flowing through these holes and move into the upper chamber. Since hydraulic fluid is pretty viscous, it will take a lot of effort for the fluid to push down, and because of this, it smooths down the compression stroke of the shock absorber. At this time, if you have noticed one thing, the check valve opens here and this allows the fluid to move inside the chamber in this state. Now once the compression is done, the spring has lot of kinetic energy which pushes the entire shock absorber to its original state. But due to gravity, these check valves remain closed and hydraulic fluid doesn't have any way to go back. At this time, the only passage where the hydraulic fluid can pass is through the rebound damper fixed hole. And this hole is so tiny that the oil flow is very restricted, and hence the violent motion of the spring is drastically dampened out. Now before understanding the monoshock type suspension, I would like to remind you that almost 85% of people have not subscribed this channel. And if you're watching this video and if you like my content, please do consider subscribing to Archeonix. Alright, let's get back to the topic. Now the monoshock suspension is most simplest form of suspension, and yet there are a lot of technical advancements. Monoshock type suspension basically has only two chambers and a piston. And the piston itself has specifically designed holes called as orifice, and this entire chamber is filled with hydraulic fluid. So during any compression or rebound, the hydraulic fluid is forced to move through this orifice, and the compression and the rebound damping occurs in this state. Now you might think, what is this nitrox gas charged monoshocks? It is nothing but there's a gas filled chamber that has been isolated from the oil chamber. While the piston compresses, the oil also tries to compress this gas, and by this, the compression stroke of the suspension becomes more faster than the rebound. Also, more advanced motorcycles have this compression adjuster, which is a small screw that determines how much of oil can pass through the chamber to get compressed by the gas. Alright, now I think you might have understood how the suspension entirely works. And during this video, and also from your friends, you might have come across many terms like slack, spring rate, rebound, compression, preload, damping, soft, hard, slow, fast, and lot of vocabularies. Let's understand everything one by one. Starting with spring rate. This is a spring from a ballpoint pen. Now if I apply some force, let us take an example that it is around X amount of force. The spring has moved from this distance to this distance. Let us assume that it has moved 1 centimeter for 1 kg of force. I think you got the idea. Spring rate is nothing but the spring stiffness to an external force. And it is usually measured in the unit of pounds per inch or kilogram per millimeter. It basically means how much kilogram of weight is required in order to compress the spring in a given distance. Now keeping this in mind, having a right spring rate to your body weight is very important, and let's see why. See, as I said before, spring compresses on a given weight. But after compressing a certain distance, the tension on the spring increases and you might require additional force to compress it even further. For a comfortable ride, you need a spring which soaks out all the bumps and stiff enough to avoid any bottoming out. And this happens while you brake or ride through a deep pothole or any different conditions. Next, let's speak about the spring preload. You might know almost all the sports category motorcycles comes with a preload adjuster. And this is the most common terminology which is most often misunderstood. For better understanding, this is a monoshock from old NS. And this doesn't have any load of the bike or the rider. But still you can see it has been compressed a little bit from the adjuster itself. And this compression is called as preload. And if you remember, as I have explained in the spring rate, springs take a lot of effort to compress even further when it is already compressed. Now adding preload to a spring only determines how much of force it is required to initiate a suspension motion. It also affects the other characteristics of suspension like how much force it requires to bottom out or get fully compressed. Let's understand in this way. Let's assume this spring's length is almost 5 cm and the space for it to move is only 3 cm. So you're basically altering the range of the spring stroke while you're riding. So having a higher preload will prevent your suspension from bottoming out as it will require more weight to compress the entire spring down. And this is the reason you get a feeling of harder suspension if you increase the preload. But you have to always keep in mind that you're not actually hardening or softening the suspension, but you're just altering the range of how much of spring strokes can be used. The primary reason why we use this preload is for setting proper sag. And the term sag just means how much of suspension gets compressed under a certain load. And sags are of two types. The first one is free sag, which basically means how much of the suspension gets compressed under the load of the bike itself. And then there is rider sag, which basically means how much of the suspension gets used when the rider sits on the motorcycle. Next, we already covered what is damping. It's nothing but how much of reduction can be done on a mechanical oscillation. It simply means just controlling the speed in which a spring compresses and extends. And we achieve this using hydraulic fluids. I have covered it already in the working of a damper. If you want to brush it up, just go back to this section and check it out. And now there are two types of damping. One is compression damping, which means how much of damping can be occurred when a spring compresses. And then there is rebound damping, and as the name suggests, is just basically controlling how much of damping can be occurred while the spring returns to its original position. Now, if someone is speaking about hard suspension or soft suspension, now you know that they're basically referring to the damping or the spring itself. And that's all about the suspension. And if you find this video informative enough, and if you like this video, do consider subscribing to Archeonix and follow me on Instagram for more such interesting content.